I'm Andrea Durbin. I'm the Director for Planning and Sustainability in the city of Portland, Oregon, in the United States. And my bureau is responsible for all the climate planning for Portland. We really have been kind of awakened to the fact that we're living in a climate-changed world. In the last couple of years, last summer, we experienced wildfire events. The West is on fire generally in the west coast of the United States, but they came very close to Portland, and we had a week where we were shuttered in our homes. We couldn't leave because the air quality was so bad. Portland had the worst air quality in the world during that week, and we didn't see the sun for days. And this past summer, the big challenge for us was extreme heat events, what was called a heat dome, that we had high heat for multiple days, and in a city that's not really prepared for it. We don't have many homes with as much air conditioning, and we don't live in a generally hot climate. So it led to many people dying. Over 60 people died in our county area, and really kind of underscored that we need to do more to accelerate not just action on climate change, but also really preparing for the impacts of climate change, because we're seeing it. Obviously, we saw it around the world with extreme rain events in Asia and Europe, and I think the news cycle is almost daily of hearing about the impacts of climate change. So it's an awakening for us, and it should be awakening for everybody. Portland has been a leader for decades. We were one of the first cities in the world to develop a climate action plan almost 3 decades ago. And we recently adopted new goals for 2030. Our goal is to cut our emissions in half by 2030 or sooner. And then by 2050, it's to become a net zero city or sooner. And I just want to emphasize the or sooner, because I think it's really important for us to recognize that we probably need to go faster than what we kind of originally thought. We need to be thinking about how do we transition, how do we build a zero carbon economy, a zero carbon city, faster than we've set the goals for. As I mentioned, we've been working on climate issues for years, and we've done a lot. But what we recognized when we looked at it is that the strategies and approaches that we took, sometimes they were really effective in reducing emissions, and sometimes they were not. And so we've developed a new tool called a pathways analysis, which helps us look economy-wide at what are the most effective strategies to reduce emissions from the building sector, the transportation sector, on the industry side. And really provides a kind of full approach and analysis for us to kind of make choices and make policy choices. And what's important is that that's focusing on reducing emissions on the mitigation side. We also recognize that we need to center people in our solutions. And so our city council adopted a climate emergency declaration where they adopted our accelerated goals. And that really helped center a climate justice approach. How do we really prioritize people in our solutions? How do we make sure that communities that are most impacted by climate change, we know that Black, Indigenous, communities of color, low-income communities are most impacted. They are carrying the burdens. They're living the burdens of climate change. When we had our heat event, the people who died were people who were living in affordable housing and mobile home parks. So we know that there are some people that are more susceptible to the impacts of climate change, and therefore we need to really center and focus on solutions that make sure that they benefit, they have opportunities, and that we really reduce the risks to them so that we don't have situations where people are losing their lives like we saw this last summer. So we have our emission sources, our biggest emission sources are buildings and transportation, like many cities. On the building side, we are really working with a Black and Brown-led coalition effort to focus on how do we improve building standards. Our old way of doing our work, we would have just focused on the energy performance of those buildings. How do we reduce the energy usage of those buildings? The new way of doing this work and centering people and climate justice in our work is focused on not just carbon mitigation and carbon emissions, but it's also looking at health standards. How do we make sure that these buildings are healthy places for people to live? How do we make sure that we're addressing cost burdens so that when we make investments, require investments in energy efficiency upgrade, that those costs are not just passed on to the renters, right, who may be low income? How do we make sure that we're addressing the resiliency concerns? Before this last summer, we were not thinking about the need to have a certain level of temperature in our buildings, right? That the responsibility of landlords to make sure that these buildings, these homes actually have cooling opportunities. So really looking more broadly at how do we build in and integrate resiliency approaches as well? How are we looking at the roofs and in a cool roof program so that we're making sure that we're building more resilient buildings stock as well. So really taking a more integrated approach in the solutions that will have far wider benefits for communities as well as the climate. On the transportation side, we're really looking, right now we're working on two areas. One is renewable fuels. We adopted a renewable fuel standard in 2006, which turned out to be one of the most effective carbon reducing programs that we had in place. So we're looking at updating that and really accelerating the transition to renewable fuels, including renewable diesel, and making that available in our local market. And that has co-benefits not just for climate, but also for reducing air pollution, which is a significant problem for us in Portland. We're also looking at electrification and how do we make sure that we're building up new opportunities for electrifying and building an infrastructure across the city. But also we have a code project going on, which is called an EV Ready Code, making sure that buildings are ready for enabling charging in homes and buildings. And we're focusing on multifamily buildings, apartments, because again, we're looking at kind of connecting those dots and making sure that low-income residents have an opportunity to get into an electric vehicle as well. In fact, if you look at reducing transportation cost burdens, we need to be prioritizing making the electric vehicles an option for low-income residents first and foremost, because the dollars that they put towards transportation is much higher, right? And so electric vehicles, cost less to operate, cost less to maintain, and so it's one way that we can actually help lift up communities and make sure that people have put their dollars towards their families rather than to transportation costs. So those are some examples. The large emitters, and for Portland, they're not the most significant sources of emissions, but in order to get to become a net zero city, they have to come along. And so we have started a dialogue and a process with the largest emitters, and for us, that's large industry. It's also institutions like universities and hospitals, and we've been involved with these stakeholders in the last year, and really around a conversation about how to decarbonize. And when we began, they were really talking about energy efficiency and all the work that's happened on energy efficiency, because that's kind of where we've been. And where we're at now is talking about decarbonizing. So it's not just about changing out our light systems, it's about how are we changing our processes, how are we fuel shifting and getting fossil fuels out of the operations. And that's the conversation that we need to be having. And so we're looking at, we're developing a policy now that really addresses that in a couple of ways. One is it would require decarbonization audits for all the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. So third-party audits, so everybody is on the same page and understands kind of what are the opportunities for reducing emissions, what are the fuel switch opportunities, where's the technology right now, and what are those opportunities about what can be adopted or what's coming up in the next, what's under development. And so decarbonization audits is the first step. And the second step is to put a price on carbon and have and really place a value on those emissions, and then direct some of those emissions back to investments, on-site investments for reducing. So actually being a partner in helping make those emission reductions and decarbonization investments. And so that's work that we think is really essential. But the other conversation that's come from the stakeholder process has been the idea that our large emitters really want to be leaders. They want to be clean industry leaders. They want to figure out how to get to be a net zero industry. And so we are developing a public-private partnership to create a clean industry hub, a hub that would provide kind of research, technical support, help kind of connect the dots, also look at policy changes and policy opportunities to, for instance, renewable natural gas right now. Renewable natural gas is really an important transition fuel, and and it's limited in its availability. So how do we prioritize the highest and best use for renewable natural gas for industrial uses over buildings? We can electrify buildings. We can't electrify intense industrial processes. So really looking at kind of what the policy opportunities are there, but doing that in a collaborative way. So again, this is early work underway, but we're excited to kind of have this engagement with industry, and also excited about the opportunity for Portland to really lead and put our stamp on. We need to be operating and moving towards being a decarbonized economy, and having industry be partners in that effort. Well, like many cities, we struggle with this as well, and we don't have all the resources that we need to implement these plans. It's part of the conversation I'm having with our city council right now. We are looking at new strategies and new approaches. So, for instance, Europe has actually been a leader in this. Pricing congestion is a new strategy that we're looking at, that we're expect to make some proposals to our city council next year. Pricing parking higher, looking at pricing the right-of-way and access to the right-of-way. The carbon fee I just mentioned is another, really looking at how do we price the pollution and what we want less of, and using those resources to invest in this transition is kind of the approach that we're looking at and applying. Again, all of that is in the works, and we're looking at developing these proposals. But what has happened in the last couple of years has been a very exciting proposal that community initiated and community led, and that is what's called the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And community developed this proposal and put it on the ballot for voters, and voters adopted it overwhelmingly in 2018. So now my Bureau, Planning and Sustainability, is administering it. And we just came out with a request for proposals, our second one, and we're going to be distributing $60 million in clean energy investments. So again, it's really helping us provide investments into directly to community, doing community-led work. So retrofitting homes that are prioritizing Black and brown households, investing in community solar, investing in green infrastructure, addressing the tree disparity that we have in the city, where in the east side of our city, we're more lower income and higher racial and ethnic diversity. That's where we have the fewer trees. And so how do we address that tree disparity across the city? That example, when we had our extreme heat event, in these neighborhoods, our eastern part of East Portland, neighborhoods were about 10 or 12 degrees higher than the rest of Portland. So, this fund, the Portland Clean Energy Fund, will really be an incredible tool and help us make this transition and really invest in the clean energy transition we need to have, but do it in a people-centered, climate justice way. It can get overwhelming, but I think what's important to know is that what we do over the next few years really matter, and it's critical. I mean, we are at this pivot point. We're at a turning point right now, and I think it's important for government leaders, business leaders, community leaders to really understand that we have an opportunity to really change the future at this point, but only if we act, and if we act with, commitment and really recognize that what has happened to date has really been kind of the low-hanging fruit. That now is when it really matters. That these are decisions that are going to be harder. There's going to be more political opposition. Because we're talking about changing how our economy is operating. But not doing so is going to have huge ramifications. And so I would say the time is now. We need to act. The next few years, really matter. We have 8 years to get to our 2030 goals and a lot of work to do. And so, be bold, be quick, don't hesitate, and really make a full commitment to this, and do it in an integrated way, and do it in a way that really centers people.